What happens when the person you humiliated reveals they were never beneath you to begin with? In part 1, we watched as Margaret Calloway's carefully planned evening collapsed the moment her driver, David Monroe, walked through the door. Her guests recognized him, not as a servant, but as someone they had destroyed years earlier. Someone who had lost everything because of their greed and cowardice. But here's what we didn't tell you. That dinner party was only the beginning. Because what happened next changed everything. Not just for Margaret, but for every single person in that room. And the truth that came out in the days that followed revealed something far darker than anyone could have imagined. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, go back and watch it now. This won't make sense without it. And if you're continuing with us, drop a comment right now and let us know what you thought of David's revelation. Did he handle it with grace? Or should he have done more? We want to hear from you. The dinner party ended just after 10 that night. Guests left quietly, without the usual lingering conversations by the door or promises to meet for lunch next week. There were no compliments about the food or the decor. People simply gathered their coats, nodded politely, and disappeared into the night. Some couldn't even look Margaret in the eye. Richard Hartley, the man who had signed the report that destroyed David's career, sat in his car in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes before finally driving away. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His wife sat beside him in silence, staring straight ahead. Finally, she spoke. "You told me you had nothing to do with that," she said quietly. Richard didn't respond. "You looked me in the eye 5 years ago and told me you weren't involved, that it was someone else's decision." Her voice cracked. "You lied to me. I didn't have a choice," Richard whispered. "There's always a choice," his wife said. And then she turned to look out the window, and they drove the rest of the way home in silence. Inside the house, Margaret stood alone in the dining room. The servers had cleared the table. The candles had burned down to nothing. The string quartet had packed up and left, and yet she couldn't move. She kept replaying the evening in her mind. The way David had walked in, so calm, so composed. The way her guests had reacted, not with laughter, but with horror. The way he had spoken, not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that made her feel small. She had wanted to embarrass him, to remind him of his place. And instead, he had reminded her of something she'd forgotten. That every person has a story, and sometimes the people we look down on are the ones who have climbed. Margaret didn't see David for 3 days after the party. He didn't show up for work Monday morning, or Tuesday, or Wednesday. She tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She told herself she wanted to apologize, but the truth was more complicated than that. She wanted to understand, how had this happened? How had a man who once sat in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the country ended up driving her to hair appointments in grocery stores? And why hadn't he ever said anything? On Thursday morning, she drove herself to his apartment. She'd never been there before, never even thought to ask where he lived. The building was old, tucked between a laundromat and a corner store in a part of town she rarely visited. The paint was peeling. The front steps were cracked. She climbed to the second floor and knocked on the door marked 2C. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. David stood there in jeans and a sweater, looking older somehow, more tired. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, surprise flickering across his face. "I wasn't expecting you. I needed to see you," Margaret said. "May I come in?" David hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was small but immaculately clean. A couch, a coffee table, a bookshelf filled with well-worn books, a single photograph on the wall, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His wife, Margaret realized. David gestured to the couch. "Please, sit." Margaret sat. David took the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret said, "Why didn't you tell me?" David looked at her for a long time. "Tell you what? Who you were? What happened to you?" David's expression didn't change. Would it have mattered? The question hung in the air. Margaret wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe that if she'd known, she would have treated him differently. But she wasn't sure that was true. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. David nodded. That's honest, at least. I'm sorry, Margaret said, for inviting you that night, for thinking it would be funny. You weren't trying to be cruel, David said. You were just reminding yourself that you were better than someone. We all do it in different ways. That doesn't make it right. No, David agreed. It doesn't. If this story is making you think differently about how we treat people, leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you realized you judged someone unfairly. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because part 3 is going to reveal something that will change how you see this entire story. Margaret leaned forward. The people at that party, Richard, Linda, the others, they all knew you. Some of them did, David said. Some of them were just there when it happened. What actually happened? Margaret asked. I know you said you were blamed for a deal gone bad, but I don't understand. How does someone lose everything over one mistake? David exhaled slowly. It wasn't a mistake. It was a lie. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a folder. He handed it to Margaret. Inside were documents, financial reports, emails, memos. The firm I worked for was handling a merger between 2 biotech companies, David explained. The acquiring company, Grayson Pharmaceuticals, claimed they had a breakthrough drug in the pipeline, something that would revolutionize cancer treatment. The numbers looked incredible, projected revenue in the billions. Margaret scanned the documents. But it wasn't real. It wasn't real, David confirmed. I started noticing inconsistencies in the clinical trial data, results that seemed too good, timelines that didn't add up. So I dug deeper, and I found emails between Grayson's CEO and the lead researcher. They were fabricating results. The drug didn't work. It was dangerous, even. But they needed the merger to go through because the company was drowning in debt. Margaret looked up, horrified. You tried to stop it. I went to my partners, David said. Showed them everything I'd found. Told them we needed to pull out of the deal immediately or we'd be complicit in fraud. And they didn't listen. They listened, David said bitterly. They just didn't care. The fees from that merger were going to be massive, tens of millions of dollars. They told me to keep quiet, to bury the evidence. And when I refused, they made a choice. He paused. They decided I was the problem. Margaret felt sick. They blamed you for everything. They leaked a story to the press, David said. Said I'd been the one pushing the merger. That I'd ignored red flags because I was desperate for a big win. They produced forged emails with my name on them. Testimonies from people I thought were friends. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. My reputation was destroyed. The SEC launched an investigation. I spent every dollar I had on lawyers trying to prove my innocence. And did you? Eventually, David said. But it took 3 years. And by then, no one cared. The story had moved on. Grayson Pharmaceuticals collapsed. The drug never made it to market. A few executives went to jail. But my name was still attached to the scandal. No one would hire me. No one would even take my calls. Margaret's hands were shaking. Your wife. You said she got sick. David's face softened, but his eyes filled with pain. The stress was too much for her. She developed heart problems, high blood pressure. She needed medication, monitoring, surgery eventually. But we'd lost our insurance. Our savings were gone. I took whatever work I could find, but it was never enough. He looked away. She died 6 months before the investigation cleared my name. She never got to know that I'd been telling the truth all along. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. David, I'm so sorry. It's not your fault, David said. But it is your fault that you invited me to that party thinking I was less than you because I drove a car for a living. That part. Margaret wiped her eyes. Why did you take the job? Working for me, I mean. You had to know some of my guests were involved. I didn't at first, David said. I needed work. You were hiring. It was simple. But then you figured it out. David nodded. About 6 months in, you had a small dinner. Richard Hartley was there. I recognized him immediately. And then, over the next few years, I saw others. Linda, James, Catherine. People who had either been part of the firm or connected to the deal. And you stayed. I stayed, David said, because I wanted to see who they'd become, whether they'd changed, whether any of them felt remorse. And did they? David was quiet for a moment. Some of them, I think, convinced themselves they'd had no choice. Others just buried it, moved on, got richer, told themselves it was just business. And me? Margaret asked. What did you see in me? David looked at her carefully. I saw someone who had never been tested, someone who'd never lost anything. So you didn't value what other people had lost. You didn't even see it. Margaret sat back, the weight of his words pressing down on her. What happens now? She asked. David closed the folder. That depends. On what? On what you do next, David said. You can go back to your life, pretend this never happened. Or you can ask yourself why you needed to humiliate someone in the first place and what that says about you. Margaret didn't have an answer. Not yet. She stood, her legs unsteady. Thank you for seeing me. David walked her to the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she turned back. Will you come back? To work, I mean? David smiled faintly. I don't think that would be good for either of us, Mrs. Calloway. And then he closed the door. Margaret drove home in a daze. Her mind raced with everything she'd learned. The lies, the betrayal, the cruelty of people she'd considered respectable. But there was something else. Something David hadn't told her. She could feel it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the folder, the documents, the emails. And then she remembered something. One of the names in those emails. A name she recognized. Not from David's story, but from her own life. The next morning, she made a phone call. And what she discovered would unravel everything she thought she knew. Not just about David, but about herself and the people she'd trusted most. Because here's what Margaret didn't know. David Monroe hadn't just been driving her around for 5 years. He'd been watching, listening, gathering evidence. And the real reason he accepted her invitation to that dinner party had nothing to do with forgiveness. It had everything to do with justice. And in part 3, you're going to find out exactly what he was planning all along. If you want to see how this story ends, comment part 3 down below. And make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will leave you speechless. Who was David Monroe really? What was he planning? And what did Margaret discover that changed everything? Watch out for part 3. You won't believe where this goes.